happens, I might drop off and it might take me a couple of minutes to log back on. So I'm sorry in advance if that happens.
Let me know when we're ready to go, Nellie.
Just waiting for it to appear.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we are live.
Thank you. Good evening. It's Tuesday and February 9th, 2021. I'd like to call Policy and Services Committee to order. The time is 7:01 p.m. Ms. Baum, would you call roll, please?
Chair Koo,
Here.
Councilmember Stone. Oh, it looks like we lost him.
Uh-oh.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Sure.
2 present, 3rd on the way.
Okay. So we have a quorum to get going, right? Okay. Thank you, Molly. With that, do we have any oral communication? Any member of the public who'd like to speak on items that are not on the agenda? I see we have one.
Yes, if there are any members of the public who would like to speak under oral communications, please raise your hand. At this time, Chair, it looks like we have one speaker. Cheryl Spencer, go ahead.
Good evening, councillors. I am Cheryl Spencer, a longtime resident of Palo Alto and a member of the Cities for CEDAW Coalition. Ms. Koo and Mr. Tanaka have heard me address the City Council and this Policy and Services Committee several times over the past 3 years about CEDAW. But let me briefly bring Mr. Stone, I hope he's listening, up to date in case he is not familiar with the CEDAW acronym. It stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And our coalition has been advocating for a city ordinance based on the principles of this long-standing United Nations Convention since February 2018. We are pleased that last fall, this committee asked the City Manager's Office to organize a community summit about gender equality. And I'm here to ask how that organizing is proceeding and to say we have 5 volunteers eager to help city staff with the design and execution of the summit. Ms. Seisenhene has their names and email addresses. On a related topic, I have previously spoken to your committee about, I note Palo Alto residents have been asked to complete the current National Community Survey, which closes tomorrow. And it does ask for the gender of the survey taker. So I hope you will ask Polco, who runs and analyzes this survey, to see if they can discern any significant gender differences in the responses that might indicate that there is some discrimination against women, be it unintentional, going on in Palo Alto. Thank you very much for your attention to my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Spencer. Ms. Baum, is there anybody else?
That was our final speaker.
Thank you. Then we return back to the committee. And our first action item is a discussion and recommendation to City Council to accept the city auditor's risk assessment report, annual audit plan, and quarterly status report. Mr. O'Rourke, you ready?
Yes, sorry about that. Good evening, distinguished members of the Policy and Services Committee. It's a pleasure to be before you today. This is the second time I've been before the committee But for the first time, we've really brought forth content to share with you, or a report to share with you. So very pleased to do so today. Traditionally, we take questions throughout these types of presentations. I know that format doesn't quite work very well for this sort of public forum. So I will work through this. If there's anything that's unclear that does warrant a question, please do feel free to stop me if indeed that's appropriate. We are presenting essentially 3 items today. The first item we'll go through is our first quarterly status report. So one of the tasks in our statement of work with the City of Palo Alto is to bring forth quarterly and an annual status report. So this quarterly status report covers the period October through December 2020. Of course, we've captured some additional information that occurred during January. And of course, we're bringing this sort of a month later than the end of the quarter because of the transition and new council members that took place in January. So this is, of course, the first Policy and Services Committee of the year. The second item we're bringing forth, the report that we're bringing forth today, is the risk assessment report. This is included within the agenda today, and we will cover in the PowerPoint presentation the report at a high level and the most critical components of that. And lastly, and I sort of view this as the most important item tonight, I'm presenting our audit plan for the next essentially 18 months, the remainder of this fiscal year into next fiscal year. We'll cover some caveats to that 18-month planning period, but essentially that's what it equates to. And finally, we'll have time for questions and discussion at the back end of the presentation. So our quarterly status report, again, covering the October through December period with a little bit of January covered as well. So this is just a refresher on our scope of work. This is how our contract is set up and the tasks within. These were designed to align to the typical tasks that a city auditor function would perform, or the Palo Alto city audit function would perform. I'm going to continuously use these tasks. It's the most simple thing for us to do. You can reconcile everything that I say to these tasks back to our contract, back to our billing. So it's sort of a one-to-one-to-one match. Our first task is the citywide risk assessment. This is a process we go through that informs then task 2, our audit planning process. So all of the activities or audit activities that we will perform as this city audit function are included within task 2, our annual audit plan. The city auditor has responsibilities for the financial audit, selection, and sort of project management related tasks of the financial audit. And as you've seen, we've helped bring financial audit reports for the FY20 audit to the Finance Committee, and then along with Ms. Noze and her team to the City Council in December. Task 4 is actual execution of the audit plan. So today we're going to discuss many proposed projects. Each of those projects is covered under task 4 of our scope of work. Task 5 is preparation of these quarterly reports, annual status reporting, and other administrative functions of the City Audit Office. And lastly, there's an evaluation and benchmarking of the City Audit function that takes place on a periodic basis, the first of which will be at the conclusion of FY22. Progress to date. So on the next 2 slides here, I'll cover the progress task by task. There's a couple that we haven't yet begun work on for reasons that we'll cover here shortly. So the citywide risk assessment, we've essentially completed all of our work and are presenting the results today. Those results are going to come at a future point in this PowerPoint presentation. Tasks to get there are included here as well. So we reviewed key information and got acquainted with the city. So your budget, your org charts, financial statements, and the annual CAFR, really key documents and data that the city has gathered. We conducted interviews not only with the executive leadership team, department directors essentially, but also with council members and other folks that came to us during the process with what they felt were important things for us to know. We reviewed the results of our risk assessment with members of the executive leadership team and with council members. We're independent and objective, but we wanted to make sure we captured the risk environment completely. And so gave an opportunity for those team members to respond to our initial results. And then of course, today we're presenting the results. Task 2 is our annual audit plan. We've developed a preliminary plan. We've gone through a process where we've presented ideas to executive leadership team members, also members of council, gotten feedback over the past roughly 2 months. And today we're presenting the results of that exercise contained within the annual audit plan report. The financial audit. So we came on at a quite a unique time. The audit field work had essentially been completed for 5 of the 6 audits. So Ms. Noze's team sort of served as that project manager of the financial audit, and we sort of stepped in on the back end of that. And as you've seen, we presented those results to the Finance Committee, and then subsequently at a January 11th meeting to the full City Council. 5 of 6 required audit reports have been presented and accepted, with 1 pending, and that's the single audit report. Lastly, we've discussed and are preliminarily pursuing a 1-year contract extension with the current financial auditors due to the extraordinary circumstances brought on by the pandemic. So more to come on that over the coming weeks as we proceed. Task 4. So Task 4 is actual execution of audit activities identified within Task 2 or Audit Plan. Of course, we don't have approval of that plan just yet, so we have not yet conducted any activities under Task 4 of our scope of work. Task 5 covers that periodic reporting, quarterly and annual, monitoring of the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, and other administrative tasks associated with the City Auditor's Office. So we're in the process of reviewing the City Auditor's Procedure Manual. So we, under audit standards, are required to have one. So that's one exercise we're going through currently. We've also obtained access to the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline and are currently reviewing the policy to ensure we comply with it moving forward. And we are delivering today the first quarterly report, and we will be delivering quarterly reports from here on out. The next quarterly report will be delivered in April, covering the period January through March. And the last task is the City Auditor evaluation. We're in the preliminary process of planning for the initial peer review. So we have coordinated or met with the Association of Local Government Auditors just for preliminary discussions. Our relationship with the city is unique. Not many cities outsource their audit function. So we've had preliminary conversations about the nature and scope of that work and are planning for it. Essentially making sure that we're adhering to standards and we'll get through that effort as painlessly as possible. So that's our progress by task. The next few slides here will be recurring slides that you'll see each time we present a quarterly status report. This first one covers the report issued. So this is pretty simple. We've conducted 2 projects essentially, and we're issuing 2 reports today, so long as they're accepted. Of course, those reports are the risk assessment report and the annual audit plan. We don't yet have any other reports in progress or projects in progress because the audit plan has not yet been approved. Simple explanation today. In the future, it will become a little bit more complex because we'll be reporting and have simultaneously projects will be beginning, completing. So this will be a little bit more meaningful in the future. We will also provide an update on the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. So the city auditor, as well as the city manager and city attorney have a role in monitoring the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. During the quarter in question, we received 1 hotline report, and we are currently reviewing it and will close that out here in the coming weeks. I would just say the matter in question does not appear to be a fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, but rather I would describe it as a personnel matter. That's very frequently the case with fraud, waste, and abuse hotlines where personnel matters are reported. Our role then as that committee is to review them, make sure the appropriate parties address the matter in question, and at that point we would consider it closed. So it's not an investigation in the sense that you'd think for fraud, waste, and abuse, if indeed it is not fraud, waste, and abuse. So I don't view any reason that won't be closed out here in the coming weeks. So that's our quarterly status report. If it's appropriate, I can pause and take questions. I guess the first question I would have is it appropriate? I'm not sure who might answer that, if that's potentially the city attorney.
I'm sorry, one more time, is what appropriate?
Questions.
So I have kind of three chunks of this presentation, and I'm curious if it's appropriate to pause now for questions from City Council, or should I just proceed through all three big portions of this?
Sure, that's really up to the chair.
Okay.
How would you like to proceed, Chair Koo?
Let's make it interactive. Thank you so much. I fear that because it's so large of a presentation that we might not capture all our questions at the end. So why don't we do questions now if there's any? Council members? Any questions? I'm sorry, I can't see the hands up, so no hands up. So I did have one about fraud, waste, and abuse, since nobody else have questions, I believe. Is it frequently that low of a number for reporting?
Short answer is yes. So traditionally what happens, what I've observed in the past is that there's usually a compelling reason to have a fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. Maybe there's instance of fraud, waste, and abuse, or, somebody has come from a separate organization and has inclinations. The city may have started the fraud, waste, abuse hotline with that in mind. Then what happens is a big effort to launch the hotline. There's, a policy that's developed, a lot of engagement in that process. There's usually some training, communication at the initial launch. And at that time, there might be, a higher number of complaints received during a quarterly period. What happens then over time, though, is, that sort of initial effort is no longer quite as advertised or it's quite as open, and the sort of responses stabilize. So I would say that's my long answer of saying yes, indeed, this is fairly normal. What I'm investigating currently is what is the training associated with ethics generally within the city. Might there be a need to sort of reinvigorate the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, or at least re-advertise that it's out there? Now that we're in a remote environment, we're not in the office, we're not physically seeing fraud, waste, and abuse hotline posters that are usually posted in public areas. So there might be a need to post something on the intranet site, potentially do a training exercise that's embedded within the city's LMS system. So I'm investigating that to see if that might spread awareness. With that said, though, the short answer to your question is yes, this is fairly normal. Any other questions? Okay, I will continue on to the next section, but please.
I see both hands. See both council members Stone and Tanaka with hands up, but I also see that the chair has frozen. I don't know if, yes, it seems like she's dropped off.
I'll defer to Councilmember Tanaka as the senior member.
Go ahead. I think there's only three of us here, so I think might as well keep it interactive as we. So why don't you go ahead, Greer?
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Mr. O'Rourke, for being here. Good to see you again. You may have touched on this already, so my apologies if you have. How is this? Who operates this hotline, and who's on the other line answering the phone and taking these complaints?
Oh, that's a great question. So the city has actually hired a third-party provider, and that third-party provider takes phone calls and sort of online reports. Those reports then are transferred into a sort of cloud-based solution, and we, as members of that sort of committee that oversees the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, receive notification. So, we'll get an email notification that a file has been that there's been a report filed. We go in and take a look and proceed from there.
And does it just get sent to you? Does it also get sent to the city department that any allegations are being made against? I'm trying to understand kind of like the kind of investigative piece to this.
So it's sent to the committee identify the sort of fraud, waste, and abuse committee. I don't know that that's the formal name, but that's the city attorney, the city manager, and myself. And that those three folks would essentially serve as the committee to investigate the matters. If there would be any need for recusal, then we would, ask that the party in question recuse themselves. So for instance, if I were to be accused of fraud, waste, or abuse, I would recuse myself. The city attorney and city manager would then handle the investigation from there. Furthermore, the party in question is not informed, upon receipt of a fraud, waste, and abuse complaint. And depending on the nature of the report, may or may not be made aware initially. So for example, if it's a personnel matter that's not really a fraud, waste, and abuse issue, that will be brought to the attention of the Human Resource Department, and they would, sort of tackle the matter from there. However, if it was a accusation of fraud, waste, and abuse of a city department, we wouldn't go to that city department and say, hey, you've been accused, prove me wrong. We would devise a plan to investigate the matter independently and draw conclusions on our own.
And at what point is council kind of notified of the report and the investigation? Is it in one of your kind of semi-annual reports to us?
If there were a true issue of fraud, waste, and abuse, we would report it separately from these presentations. And I believe, and Ms. Stump can correct me if I'm wrong, that would be done in a closed session type of setting. And what you would see is summary level data like you see now in these quarterly reports. So we would report on the matters that have been opened, closed, items that remain open, sort of at a high level or summary level during these public forums.
All right, thanks. That's helpful. I'm done.
I would just add to that the availability of closed session under California law depends on the nature of the complaint and where it hits in our organization. So we have to address that on a case-by-case basis.
Chair, you were out, but Greer just finished this question. Can I ask my questions now?
Oh, yes, please. I'm so sorry. My internet just went off, but thank you.
We need faster, more reliable internet. So maybe a future PNS topic. Yeah. So who can file is it? I assume it's anonymous, and if is it anonymous or not? And also who can members of the public, can vendors, can who's this open to right now?
So it is anonymous, and it is open to, from my understanding, to city employees.
Why not members of the public or anyone? Why just city employees?
So maybe I can help with that. So that issue was discussed when the hotline was set up, and that's a really different type of a complaint line. And so the council made a policy decision at that time to focus on city employees who would be having that employee type of access or knowledge. Those were the issues that the council was the most concerned in focusing on with this program. And Mr. O'Rourke might have additional comments about broader types of hotlines that he may have seen.
I guess I would just add to that, and of course, I believe this was launched at least 3 to 4 years ago, or at least the most recent revision of the policy, I believe, was in 2017. So at least preceding that. If you look at statistics related to fraud, waste, and abuse, the majority of cases are reported by sort of coworkers or folks that are very closely tied to the individuals committing those acts. That's probably played into the decision-making that took place. And I would say also there's no reason for the public not to comment if they believe there's suspicion of fraud, waste, and abuse. And there's channels that exist for them to report those. Of course, coming directly to somebody like the 3 members on the committee, and or, if it's a criminal act, potentially going straight to the police, for example. So there's other ways that those instances could be reported without sort of the internal hotline.
So do other cities have it so that only employees could do it, or do they have it so that other people, non-employees, can also make submissions?
Both types exist. I can speak from my experience, and that would be that most have a similar setup as the city of Palo Alto. So it is possible to have a broader, broader availability, but most cities choose to do what the city of Palo Alto has done. And there is a cost element to this. I don't recall the exact cost associated with Palo Alto's contract, but in many cases, you pay by report if you exceed a certain number of reports during an annual period. And if you open this up to the broader population, you'll get a lot of reports, many of which will not be instances of fraud, waste, and abuse, and it will turn into sort of a complaint hotline. And then you'll be paying to hear complaints that you would have heard otherwise. People would have just gone directly through their, representation and/or members of the executive leadership or department heads.
The reason why I ask is I remember, and this was before my time, but that there was a time when Menlo Park residents saw Palo Alto utility trucks in their neighborhood, and they were trying to figure out like what the heck, right? And what was happening was the utility employees were moonlighting using city property equipment and time to do home improvement work for people, for residents, right? Even non-Palo Alto residents. And so like, that would have been a good example of, this might have been a good thing for people to report, right? And how could you report it? I think eventually this got discovered, and I forgot what happened to the people, but that's just an example of something that I was thinking of in terms of fraud, waste, and abuse type of issues that, might be good for, what might be good for people to be able to report.
In those circumstances, I suppose I would have two responses. So that the members of the public, I would reach out, and I would reach out to somebody independent, objective within the city. And of course, the city auditor function plays that role. I think the city manager and city attorney could potentially, of course, they're members of the committee, could potentially be good folks to reach out to as well. And, part of the reason I'm sort of investigating the training that goes along with this is it's really important that other city employees who might be aware of this, not participants, but aware of it and don't think it's the right thing to be doing, that they take the initiative to internally report this. So their colleagues who might know that they are doing work on the clock to make extra cash might have reported this internally through the hotline.
It actually wasn't. It was actually reported by I think Menlo Park residents. That's actually how it was reported. And that's why, to me, and that's actually a real case of fraud, waste, and abuse. And so that's why I was curious to know why not allow anyone to do it, right? It's kind of like the bumper sticker on the back of truck saying, "How's my driving?" type thing, right? So I would be interested in that. Why not? Because you only got one complaint for a quarter, which doesn't strike me as a lot, right? The second question is there like a reward that people get?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, because in some places they actually get a portion if they, if this is found to be substantiated, that they will get a portion of the. It's kind of like a reward. They get a portion of the. So it's like an incentive, right? So I guess, for me, I would favor opening this up to everyone as well as giving some sort of partial reward. That if someone reports something that is substantiated, and I think this would make the city more efficient and, kind of, especially right now when we're going through kind of tough budget times.
So I think we better carry on. And
oh, that's all I had.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Tanaka. Mr. Rourke.
Okay. Thanks, Ms. Gu. I will proceed to the next section, which is our citywide risk assessment. So this is task one of our statement of work with the city, and that is to conduct a citywide risk assessment to inform our annual audit planning process. So this is actually, I believe, the same slide I showed when we initially met, but that not all of you were on the committee at that time. So we conduct a citywide risk assessment essentially in 4 phases. First is planning, that's general kickoff type activities. Our information gathering phase, so this is where we conduct interviews, we review information like budget documents, capital planning documents, the CAFR, organizational charts, really anything that will help us get acquainted with the city and sort of glean risk. Next, we conduct the sort of risk analysis. So we document all of the auditable areas, and actually in our report, probably 60 or 70% of the actual report content, the appendices, are actually those auditable areas. And then we go through a risk scoring process, and that's dependent on likelihood and impact, which we'll dive into a little bit more here shortly. And then lastly, we report. So we prepare a draft report and then of course finalize it. We don't view our reports as final until accepted by council. So that's why you see our reports marked as final draft at the moment. Risks we consider. So there's many different risk types. We list kind of the most common here on the left. Financial risks, these are things you probably think of most for auditors. Did we record things in the accounting system correctly? Are we paying our vendors properly? So really deals with accounting of dollars and cents. Operations, that generally refers to process, efficiency, and sort of day-to-day operations of the governmental organization. Technology, so we think of hacking, cybersecurity related risks, IT asset management. Now we're of course in a remote environment, so we have a lot of mobile technology at play. So risks associated with IT and technology. Fraud, waste, and abuse that we just talked about. Strategic risks, questions, are we achieving our strategic objectives as a city? Compliance related risks, of course, we're subject to a lot of compliance requirements. Human resources is an area where there's a lot of compliance requirements, but really it goes across the entire organization. Environmental regulations, state compliance requirements, as well as federal, as well as local. So lots of compliance considerations, and reputational risk. So those are some risk types we consider. We're not focused solely on financial, we're not focused solely on operational, but really we take a holistic view of risk in our risk assessment process. Once we've identified risk, we go through a risk scoring process. Risks are scored based on the likelihood and impact, likelihood being the probability of an adverse event occurring, and impact being the financial or other impact of that adverse event occurring. And those two things put together sort of form a mathematical expected value type of equation and provide the overall scoring by which we measure risk and sort of prioritize our audit activities. Our overall risk scoring is right-sized, so to speak, to the city of Palo Alto. So for example, the capital program actually is a great example. We've worked with organizations that have much smaller capital programs, and a $5 million project to them is super significant. We've also worked with organizations that have, multi-billion-dollar capital programs. Well, we have to right-size that in our scoring process. So you'll see, for example, that a project of the size of the public safety building receives the highest potential impact scoring, so $100+ million project. And that's because we've right-sized our scoring to the city of Palo Alto's capital program. I'm using capital program just as an example, but we've right-sized all of our scoring for the city of Palo Alto. Some key considerations before we get too far into this. One overall note, so you'll see we've analyzed the city operations across the entire city. It's really important to point out that at this point, we are not drawing any conclusions. This risk assessment report is not a list of findings, it's not a list of observations, it's not a list of things that need to be fixed. It's really an assessment of risk. Where could things go wrong? We are not diving deep enough at this point to draw conclusions of that nature, but rather assessing risk, identifying where things could go wrong, identifying areas where we as the audit function can add value. And then of course, through the audit planning process, designing audits to focus in on those areas where we can add most value. Really important, I think what will happen frequently is that folks will review our reports and see examples of potential risks, read those examples, and then say, well, this is going wrong. That's not at all what this is communicating. So just want to make that clear. You'll see also that we categorize risk. We actually categorize risk in a number of ways. I already went through the risk types on the prior slide. We also categorize them into these three sort of big buckets. And the appendices that you see in the back of the report have kind of groupings in these three categories. Environment, strategy, and governance, these are sort of citywide concerns. So ethics, the compliance environment, the labor environment, sort of big concerns that have implications across the entire city. Major projects and initiatives, I use the capital projects as a simple example. So those are included within major projects and initiatives, but it also includes things like system implementations. So an enterprise resource planning, ERP, or financial system implementation would show up here. From time to time, we also see organizations that have significant initiatives related to employee engagement and satisfaction. So they'll conduct an employee engagement survey, identify a dozen or so initiatives, and then from there implement corrective actions to enhance employee engagement. Well, that employee engagement activity can be considered an initiative within an organization. So it's major projects and initiatives across the entire city. And then lastly, function-specific risks. So this is where we go into each department, each division, and identify risks throughout the entire city. Things that could potentially go wrong from finance, HR, IT, public works, police, fire, really across the entire organization. So you'll see most risks or the most items in our audit areas that fall within function-specific risks. Overall, so just some quick statistics. We've identified 148 auditable areas. And I guess I would point out that 148 doesn't mean that's the entire universe of potential audits we could conduct. In fact, within each auditable area, there's typically one or two things that we could really focus an audit activity around. So the number of potential audits really is in the hundreds. But within the document you see before you, we have 148 auditable areas. So literally 148 rows in the matrix that you see in the appendix. And those are categorized sort of in that distribution that you're seeing at the bottom of this slide. We don't seek by any means a normal distribution. You're seeing some skewing in what you see right now, but it does give us somewhat of an indication of whether our scoring methodology has truly been right size. Now, if I were you, I would ask the question, why is there some skewing? Why do we have more low, moderate? Well, one big reason is that we've included a lot of small capital projects. So really, projects that we wouldn't really audit, but a lot of them fall in a certain dollar threshold. So we have a lot of items in the capital project in that low, moderate category. So one example of why you see some skewing. But again, we're not seeking a normal distribution necessarily. And then the primary purpose of this whole effort of task one is really to inform the audit plan. Again, we're not identifying recommendations or audit findings, but we're really looking to inform our audit plan. So key risks. What are the key risks within the city? I think I have 2 slides here that cover 8 or 10 areas. And many of them are high or in the high moderate category. So of course, COVID-19 response. And when we mean that to cover multiple related risks, the first of which is health and safety. Of course, health and safety related to city employees, folks that are delivering services, that are going into the offices. And also we mean that to refer to service delivery and service delivery expectations. So really the impact of COVID-19 overall on the city. Economic recovery. So of course, very much tied to the pandemic. And of course, we're referring to the economic recovery from the pandemic. Health of our revenue sources. We've gone through as a city cost control and budget reduction measures. So there's related risks there. And then long-term financial health, which we had long discussions around that, and we will continue to as a city. Another key risk area is the capital program, and more specifically in this case, the public safety building, just as a large component of that. Risks related to internal controls and process efficiency for managing those types of projects, managing compliance with those construction contracts and outside vendors. And then specifically with the public safety building, it's sort of a fixed fee type of project, which means that we have to be very diligent where there's change orders and make sure they're justified, follow the appropriate channels. So kind of a key risk area or key consideration for those types of projects, like the public safety building. High cost claims and litigation. This isn't necessarily an area where the city auditor focuses their time, and this is where the city attorney focuses her time. But I would say, of course, there's potential, legal action against the city, and some of those can be high dollar amounts. So, of course, a high risk area for the city. Workforce and succession planning. I really summarize this as attracting and retaining talent, but there's a lot of dynamics to it. Where Palo Alto is, the ability for the city to bring in a workforce, highly qualified workforce, retain that workforce, and the cost of living being very high in the area. So those sorts of related risks. And succession planning, meaning we want to make sure that we are building people up and having the ability to create new managers and management over time as people retire and attrition takes its toll. So as you can see, I'm going to go through 10 areas, but I mentioned there's 148. So we're not going through everything, but the next several, asset management. So the city, in particular, the utilities have many assets, physical assets. And so there's risks related to recording and accounting for those city assets. And then, of course, we have to maintain those assets and ensure that they are used through their usable life. Contract management, we outsource. I guess we're a prime example of that. Outsource many functions within the city. So we have to monitor performance and service expectations of those third parties. And then, of course, there's contract management related risks, and we need to make sure that those vendors are performing and we're holding them accountable when things go wrong. IT risks. So you'll notice probably about a dozen or 15 IT risk areas, many of which are in the moderate high category. A few of those are database and data management. So of course we have a lot of information. Some of it's personally identifiable. Some of it's information on the residents of our city. So it's really important that we protect that data. And of course there's compliance requirements from a variety of sources, including state government. So really key risk area. The city is going through an ERP system upgrade, a two-phase process. And so that's a key risk area, making sure that we're getting the most out of our ERP system and being highly efficient through its use. And I've included disaster recovery here specifically because essentially the pandemic has tested us and has been a sort of disaster in and of itself, and something that the IT department has had to manage. So lots of related risks there. Investments, debt, and cash management. It's a lot grouped into one sort of category, but of course, we have policies that we must adhere to as a city for all three of those. We're on the verge of issuing new debt associated with the public safety buildings. So there's some key risk associated with that activity. And then particularly given the current cash crunch, we have risk related to liquidity and the city's cash position. And then lastly, I've mentioned ethics. Ethics is really critical for a city organization for a variety of reasons. Of course, fraud, waste, and abuse can result in financial loss to the city, but potentially in some circumstances more detrimental to the organization could be reputational damage. We might find that there's an instance of duplicative employee reimbursement, or if somebody ghost employees, and it might not result in a significant financial loss, but of course our reputation would be very much harmed and public trust would be very much harmed as well. So ethics is a very critical area to consider, and of course that's why we have a fraud, waste, and abuse hotline set up. So again, I want to pause. I know we're putting whatever it is, 50-page report in 5 or 6 slides, but I want to pause and sort of address questions here as well. Ms. Koo, if you want to maybe start and direct traffic.
Sure. Council colleagues, you have any questions for Kyle on this, the key risks that he has mentioned? It's a lot. Anyone? Councilmember Stone?
Yeah, I mean, is this kind of the time to go through that spreadsheet of the 148 risks and ask questions specific to any of those, or just to these risks identified? How would you like us to proceed, Chair?
Oh, please, it pertains to the risk, so feel free. If that's all right with you, Mr. O'Rourke? Yes?
Absolutely.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and do that?
Great, thank you. Sorry, just kind of pulling up my notes here. Well, just kind of to start, you just mentioned like reputational risk as being one of the key risk factors, and I saw it identified several times throughout the report. What's kind of like the primary risk associated with when you're talking about reputation? I mean, is the concern, I mean, of course, reputation is important, but when we're kind of looking as far as just city finances and just the general well-being of the city, is that concern focused on things like the city's credit, our ability to retain and recruit employees to the city? What's kind of the thinking behind that? Sorry.
We lost your voice.
Yeah.
Kyle, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. Apologies. Mr. Stone, both of the examples you just gave are indeed great examples of reputational risk and the potential harm to the city. I think, most importantly is loss of public trust. We are you are elected by, citizens of Palo Alto and are elected to serve and make decisions on behalf of them. And of course, you then hire competent city staff to help run the city. When we lose public trust, it really puts a significant strain on the system and really, inhibits our ability to deliver day-to-day operations, deliver on the strategic plan, and deliver what we've promised our citizens. So I would view that as the most significant reputational risk. And really, any of these areas where we've said there's potential reputational risk could result in that, depending on the significance of the issue. So, for example, fraud, waste, and abuse is a great area. Mr. Tanaka mentioned the issue earlier. So, I don't know that situation, but I'm going to maybe use it as an analogy. But we have a potential member of the city staff. They're logging a couple hours to go and do work on their own, and are getting paid independently of their work for the city. We might pay them, let's say, $100 of labor costs. They didn't actually deliver anything. Of course, in that case, somebody found out about it, reported it, and I'm sure there were significant issues that arose. So people coming to public meetings, demands that we be more diligent in monitoring our staff. Maybe we incur capital costs to monitor vehicles more closely. So we're incurring significant financial costs as a result of that reputational damage. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I guess point being, in many circumstances, that's sort of the result, is loss of public trust.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Then risk ID number 7, recruitment and retention, and you spoke about this briefly. Talks about the city's difficulty in retaining and recruiting employees due to things like pension reforms, cost of living. Have we kind of seen this trend actually playing out in Palo Alto? Do we have data that supports that? I mean, it seems to be true, and I think anecdotal evidence really supports the idea that it's difficult to recruit and retain. But are we seeing, has that become a significant problem within the city, or is this kind of speculation at this point?
I don't know that I would call it speculation, but I also don't know that I could point to any specific data points that would, prove that this is an issue. I think for sure we could point to high cost of living. I think that is something we could definitively say. I think there's pockets of the city where it's hard to recruit. And despite me not having those figures, I think that we could come up with those. So a good example that I've heard would be line level workers in public utilities or public works. Those are folks where, from what I understand, they're commuting long distances. So I think those are, tough to hang on to, and potentially folks could get paid similarly or more to go work at a surrounding community or surrounding utility and not have to commute as far. So I would definitely say it's somewhat anecdotal, but I think there's definitely pockets where if we were to dive a little bit deeper or conduct an audit activity around it, I think we would pretty quickly come up with the data points that you're looking for.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going to take much looking into it to actually find the data points. But I am curious and interested to see that, because I do. My gut says that that's happening, but I do think we need to be making decisions based on actual evidence and data. So looking forward to seeing that. I'll do one more question, and then, because I don't want to just take up all the time, I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I noticed risk ID number 8 talks about Palo Alto providing Stanford with police services. And that I was curious about, because I know I'm curious to what extent do we provide those police services? Because I know Stanford has its own sheriff's department that's under the county's sheriff office. To what extent does Palo Alto Police serve Stanford?
So I think it's probably potentially might be mischaracterized here, but my understanding is that there's dispatch services, so those are within the police department, and Palo Alto assists with that. So I think it's dispatch related. And I would imagine there's instances where there's, and I'm going to forget the terminology, but cross jurisdiction where the city, helps respond to instances within, significant instances or instances where the Stanford Police Department struggle to respond. So I think it's more relating to that crossover, not specifically, Palo Alto police officers walking the street, so to speak, within the university area.
Okay, thank you. That clarification is helpful. Chair Koo, should I turn it over to you or Councilmember Tanaka, and then come back for additional questions?
Let's see if Councilmember Tanaka has any questions. If not, then we'll just keep going.
I had one, but Councilmember
let's
Stone
come
already
back.
asked it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So why don't you keep going, Councilmember Stone?
Okay, sorry, Councilmember Tanaka, I beat you to it. But I have one of my next questions, I think, is one that you'll appreciate, because you inspired it. So on risk ID 34, replacement of city vehicles, I know we replaced those vehicles based on guidelines such as age, mileage, and them becoming obsolete. Councilmember Tanaka made a really good point a couple weeks ago, I think, when one of these items came up on consent about when we replace some very expensive service trucks with very little mileage and years on them. Is that kind of part of this auditing process, to kind of look at those guidelines to ensure that we're mitigating wasteful spending? Because I really thought, after that consent item, when Councilmember Tanaka explained his vote, I was moved by that. I thought the logic made a lot of sense, and made me wonder what those guidelines are, and if they're being if there's proper oversight on that.
So I would say, if we were to conduct an audit activity itself, yes, that would definitely be in consideration. For the purposes of the risk assessment, we didn't dive deep enough to draw a conclusion related to that. So certainly that plays into the risk score and sort of the risk assessment we've done thus far, but we haven't gone deep enough to be able to assess that. Now, I would say, and I'm not, hopefully you don't dive much deeper with questions, but there was an audit activity of fleet management conducted in the past several years. So this is sort of an area that's been covered by city audit in the past, and there are likely recommendations that stemmed from that to improve efficiency like that you're mentioning.
Okay, thank you. One on risk ID number 79, EMT/paramedics. I'm not sure if this was a typo or not. It said that the report said that 2 paramedics and 2 EMTs are needed to be on scene for every event. Is that
I think that's a typo.
Do we really need 4 medical professionals on scene of any event?
I think that might be a typo.
Okay, so it's 2 paramedics or 2 EMTs, or a combination.
I believe what you're saying is accurate. And in fact, I have these numbers incorrect, and I chatted with the fire chief with Geo. And he recently reached out to me, so maybe that's indeed why what he wants me to correct. But I do believe your thought process is accurate.
Okay.
And you, sorry, you referred to 76?
Yeah. 79.
79. I believe you're correct. I don't believe it requires 4 respondents.
Okay. And then just kind of a question on the process on these. Like, so just for example, risk ID 125, police overtime, made a really good point about unpaid overtime claims, and the issues with California's, kind of law and issues with that, and Palo Alto police often working overtime, creating burden on officer well-being and city finances. Are these reports just kind of meant to identify those as issues, or do they also help kind of propose solutions? Because I mean, I think that's a critical issue for our city finances and for the well-being of our officers. But right, we have to have police officers on the street, keeping the community safe. So is that the type of thing that you present the problems to us, and then we try to come up with the solution? Since I'm new to this, I just kind of appreciate that kind of clarification.
Yes, and I would say, so we have not drawn that conclusion. So these examples of potential risks, we use that terminology intentionally because we haven't conducted an audit, so we haven't been able to draw that conclusion. Those are things that could hypothetically go wrong. So at this point, no, I don't think that we're suggesting these are problems that City Council should be looking into, but rather, this is the city auditor's process for determining whether or not we need to dive into these issues and determine whether or not in actuality there's a problem.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll stop with my questions now.
Thank you, Councilmember Stone. Councilmember Tanaka, did you think of any other questions you may have?
No others at this very moment. Thank you, though.
Okay, so I had one that I lost right now, but it has to do with printing services. Yeah, print and mail, number 43, ID risk. So over here in the risk areas, there's strategic. I understand operational and financial. How can you kind of help me understand the strategic part of the risk?
Sure, and I guess, I would say that risk areas, we generally are pretty liberal in how we assign those. But in terms of strategic risk, so, currently the city's strategic plan, not to say that this is necessarily called the strategic plan, but your strategy involves identifying cost savings measures and looking at functions very in a seeking cost effectiveness. And so, we say this is strategic in that this is an area where the city could potentially look for those sort of cost savings measures and sort of achieve that strategy, cost effectiveness.
Okay, because then I would ask the necessity of it. How does it? How is it viewed in terms of the strategic, in terms of cost wise, and then the necessity of having that service there too. So that's an interesting thought. And when I was reading this, I was just kind of wondering, how is it strategic? But thank you. So we can, if there's no more questions, then we can go on. And this is how your risk report is going to come to us in this format.
Yes,
in this matrix
indeed.
From it. Okay.
Yeah. So the first 15 or so pages are the narrative, and then 60 to 70% of the actual report is indeed the matrix.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
If you think of any other questions as we go through this, because obviously we're going to dive into the audit plan. If you think of questions we need to tie back to the.
Sorry, Chair, I raised my hand. I don't know if you can see it now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. So one other question I was just thinking of, and I really appreciate Councilmember Stone's comprehensiveness. So that was really good. Thank you. One other thing I was just thinking of is, are you doing any work around staff report quality at all?
We are not currently conducting audit activities related to staff reporting. I don't believe that is necessarily represented as a risk within our risk matrix. And so, you know, I don't know that we've considered it as being, you know, a potential audit activity that we could conduct. So I guess in short, no, but I'd be curious what you're thinking if you wanted to dive deeper.
Well, I was just thinking
benefit.
Back to the example that Councilmember Stone cited, which is, and maybe this on us as council members, but I was just thinking that, like, for instance, last night, was it last night? Yeah, it was last night. You know, one thing that distributed on one of the staff reports was, you know, apparently someone was bidded out to multiple bids, but the bids weren't there. We didn't know whether it was the high, the low, right? You know, like, for instance, you know, some of the seeming issues about that service truck that was replaced with very low mileage, you know, wasn't, it's sometimes the details are kind of buried or missing, right? Often they're missing, which is the more troubling part. And so it's actually hard for us to make good decisions, right? I mean, sometimes we ask the questions, but and sometimes the answers come back, but they're not, because these are all consent items, so it's very hard to dive very deep. And so a lot of times things get passed, even though maybe they deserve a little bit more scrutiny. So I don't know if it's the audit activity or maybe it's just, we just got to demand better from staff. But to me, it just seems like some of this, in terms of trying to be efficient with our you know, what limited capital we have, it would be kind of alleviated with, you know, better or clearer staff reports. And so I was thinking about, like, what one of the public speakers yesterday talked about. I think he was referring to the public safety building, but he was saying, like, oh, you know, the public safety building, it was like the DAC was stacked, well, it was stacked, right, for the approval. And I actually had to agree with him, right? It seemed like it was, right? There wasn't, we don't necessarily hear the counterpoints of, like, well, here's the, you know, like last night I kind of was thinking, wow, you know, it would be really great if we heard this budget when we were talking about this public safety building, because I mean, it's pretty dire, even though, you know, we're doing scenario B, which is, in my mind, you know, a little bit optimistic, but I'm hoping that I'm wrong about it. But I mean, it would have been good for us to hear about that. But it's just sometimes, like, I mean, because we make decisions on council with information we're presented with, but sometimes the information is not as easy to discern signal from as it could be, right? So anyways, it's just something about trying to enable us to make better decisions with clearer, better staff reports. So that's something I was just wondering, and especially given that you work with multiple cities and you kind of see a variety of qualities. Like, do other staff reports show the pros and cons? Do they not tell the bid range and tell you what they got? Do they not try to, like, lay out the salient facts so that, you know, the council members or whoever's making decisions can you know, can make decisions that are best interest of the public?
In short, I would respond to that by saying we have not considered an audit activity of that nature. We hypothetically could, so that's, you know, something we could do and sort of do a comparison to like organizations and you know, maybe be able to draw conclusions like that. So it is possible. I don't know that I've drawn any conclusions. I could speak to that, you know, greatly at this point. But would be curious to learn more, and if that's, you know, of interest by multiple council members, we certainly could consider that sort of exercise.
I was going to say that perhaps, and Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, that this might be necessitate a council referral.
So a couple different ways you could go there. I mean, certainly council can work directly with staff on its expectations. Council can give direction to its CAOs who directly are responsible for that, primarily the city manager and to a lesser degree myself. Or if you are interested in having pursuing something like that through the auditor function, I think that's a conversation you could actually have now with the auditor. I'm not sure how the auditor is thinking about the material that he's bringing to you tonight and any potentials for adjustments to that. So, Mr. O'Rourke, perhaps you could talk about that.
Sure. So as you'll see when we dive into the plan, we have, we're sort of projecting 18 months worth of audits, but we're only asking for approval of a subset of the task orders for those audits. And you will see that we do have room for adjustment. So, shuffling audits year to year, removing audits and replacing them. And I have no problem coming to policy and services with adjustments to the audit plan. In fact, I'm going to be coming relatively frequently. So making adjustments is definitely possible. I would say in my independent, objective, and candid, thought process right now, I would say if you haven't yet exhausted the direction to staff regarding reports, I would take that as probably the first venue to solve the pain point that I'm hearing right now. And in addition, potentially rejecting decisions where you don't have the ability to, answer some of those critical questions.
I do that
don't
every
have
Monday already. So, but yeah, my colleagues know about that. So I rail on this all the time, but no, not much change. But it's a good. That's why I brought it up to you, just because I do talk about this quite frequently, but it bothers me actually, just because I feel like, we're trusted with the public's money, and we should be trying to make sure that it's spent well. So that's why. But I rail on this every Monday, basically. I mean, everyone here knows about that, so so that's not new.
So since we're having an informal conversation, I can't resist just stepping in with an observation from many, many, many years in working in local government, that council members have a variety of perspectives on how to balance their policymaking and strategic role with their oversight role. And the kind of information that you're speaking about, Councilmember Tanaka, is really, really focused on what is important to you, but many council members would consider more of an operational or staff function where they're willing to delegate more of that analysis to the staff and take a higher level approach to any review or oversight. And so that's, I mentioned this partly for Councilmember Stone, who's joining us new as a council member, that this is something to think about and sort of chart your way as a public official of how you believe you can best use your limited time and focus and energy and work with the community to best serve the city, and how to balance those two roles.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the reason why it hasn't happened is because there's not a majority of council members who thinks that we should hear both sides of. I mean, I like to hear both the pros and cons, but not everyone cares about that, right? And especially for consent items. So I think the city attorney is correct in that, the CAOs will do as the majority request. So I get that.
Is that all, Councilmember Tanaka?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. O'Rourke, if you continue. Oh, before you go, is that a picture of Palo Alto?
It's supposed to be.
Oh, okay.
I had our marketing team buy some, get the rights for some pictures, and this is supposed to be Palo Alto. I sure hope it is. Otherwise, that would be quite embarrassing.
It looks like City Hall there.
It does.
Yeah,
It does.
I've been looking at it, trying to figure out where it was taken from, and because we don't allow drones, but it does seem like it's pretty high up, and I can't quite fathom where it was taken from.
Yeah, I was looking at it too.
My guess is from that Alma parking garage.
Could be, but
That's
good for
just a
you.
wild guess.
Good for you, because I was looking at the staff report and I was going to say, hey, Kyle, we need Palo Alto pictures. And you got it here. Thank you.
And what a pretty city. My goodness. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to
I'm glad this is, I'm glad this is indeed Palo Alto. That would be quite embarrassing. Okay, so I guess the third big bucket for discussion today is the actual audit plan. So this next series of slides will cover what we're recommending. And of course, there's a second report in your packet that is indeed our audit plan. So how do we develop an audit plan? What are considerations? So we walk through these in a little bit more detail in the report, but there's a variety of considerations. Just because something is high risk doesn't necessarily mean it automatically goes on the audit plan. So it's not just that simple. But of course, the primary consideration is the risk assessment. So we go through that process. We identify where we can, where there are high risk items within the city, and of course, those high risk areas are the first areas we consider for audit activities. So that is our primary source of data. So again, the 148 rows you see in the back end of that initial report. The second consideration is our ability to add value. We as the city audit function, and particularly with a firm like Baker Tilly, we have the ability to conduct audits in a variety of areas and bring in subject matter experts that can make recommendations for enhancement, in many areas within the organization. Some areas, though, are out of our purview. I mentioned earlier, one of the high-risk areas is, potential litigation the city might face. That is not an area where the city auditor typically has the ability to add value. So we would not recommend that we get involved in litigation, for example. So our ability to add value is the second item we consider. City council direction. So we, we report directly, or I report directly to city council. And of course, if there's areas that city council wants to dive into, we of course take that into consideration. And in fact, did seek input from all council members in drafting our audit plan. Audit coverage. This really means, there's a couple of examples. So audit coverage, that could mean we want to cover many areas within the organization. So not just focus in on finance or HR, but rather sort of hone in on many areas and seek to add value throughout the organization. So designing an audit plan that covers many areas within the organization. In addition, we could conduct audit activities that will touch on many risk areas. So a great example of this that you're going to see in our audit plan here shortly is a construction project controls review. So we're going to review internal controls and processes that apply to almost every capital project within the city, particularly ones that are outsourced. So that one audit activity actually might cover a dozen or more risk areas that we've identified in the risk matrix. That's great. So each individual risk area might be moderate risk, some might be low, but by covering many of them, we're covering kind of collectively a lot of risk area. Prior audits. So of course there has been a city audit function, and in addition, the city is subject to audits by external organizations, compliance audits, the financial audit by another third party, and there's other sort of consulting reports that aren't audits, but sort of add value to the organization in similar ways. We want to consider those. We don't want to duplicate effort. We don't want to conduct the same audit year after year after year and come up with the same recommendations necessarily. So we consider those prior audits in developing our current year audit plan. Ripeness, which sort of intertwines with ongoing internal initiatives. So if there's an internal initiative that's designed to correct something we know has gone wrong, well, internal audit or the city audit function might not want to step in and start auditing again. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel and draw conclusions that we already know. And in some cases, we want that initiative to take hold and those corrective actions to take place, and then take a retrospective look and identify additional actions that could take place beyond the initiative that has been completed. And scheduling. So you're going to see that I'm already today going to suggest that we have a modification to our internal audit plan, and it directly deals with scheduling. So we'll get to that here shortly, but there's certain circumstances in which it wouldn't make sense for us to conduct an audit based on operations and how things are scheduled internally to the organization. Now, with that said, we wouldn't necessarily avoid an audit just because folks think they're busy at a certain time of the year, but we definitely want to take that into consideration. And as you'll see here shortly, there's a really good reason to consider scheduling on one of the proposed audit activities. So I wanted to offer a little bit of orientation to the audit plan itself. So there's a requirement, of course, that the city auditor develop an annual audit plan. In this case, we're in the middle of the fiscal year, so this plan is actually intended to take us through the end of fiscal year 22. I'm going to say a little bit more than this says on the slide here, so if this is confusing, please stop me. But when we were in contract negotiations to do work with the city, we obviously were observing that we were going to start mid-year. And at that point, we thought it would be wise not to reconduct this same robust activity at the beginning of the next fiscal year, but rather a smaller update. So in our contract, you'll see that we have a healthy budget for this initial risk assessment, and then a moderate budget for the update that'll take place at the beginning of the next fiscal year. With that in mind, we wanted to do a thorough planning process, go 18 months, and that's what we've done here. I said a lot, but I guess important if you're looking at our budget and why things are structured that way. And what you're then also seeing, and this is sort of shown in 3 pages of the actual audit plan, we've grouped audits into 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Simply, phase 1 are audits that will start now and end before the end of the fiscal year, for the most part. Phase 2 are audits that will start this fiscal year and will complete next fiscal year. So they'll cut across multiple fiscal years. And phase 3 are audits that will conduct and complete in FY22. So we've grouped them like that for a couple of reasons, but one of them is to show how the dollars and hours associated with each audit activity will tie into the overall budget for our work. It's an easy way to depict it. I covered that sort of second sub-bullet under the first main bullet. The risk assessment as an audit annual activity. So we're doing it now. We'll do a smaller one at the beginning of next fiscal year. And as you'll see, we have some ability to be agile. So agile is sort of the hot buzzword in the audit world these days. Really, we want to be able to adapt. So I'm asking for approval of a subset of task orders, which really give us the contractual authority to do the audit activity. And we're not asking for approval of all task orders so that we can continue to adapt as we go. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we'll come to policy and services over time. And as things change, as council's priorities change, we have the ability to change our plan and make updates as we go. We want to have that ability to be agile, so to speak. Audit activity. This is a term that you'll probably hear me use over and over and over. An audit activity essentially refers to any audit type project that the city audit function will conduct. And each one of those projects under task 4 is something I will call an audit activity. So sometimes you'll hear other words like an assessment, a review, an audit. I just collectively refer to all of those as audit activities, just as an FYI. Task order approval. So I'd mentioned this. We're bringing the audit plan. So again, this is probably the first third of the report that you have. The second 2/3 of that report are all of the task orders associated with the project that we're hoping to actually conduct. So because we are a third party, we have contractual documentation associated with our work. We actually get formal approval by the policy and service chair to conduct each project. So Ms. Cooley will, at the beginning of March, post council approval, ask for your sort of signature on each of those audit activities in the task orders that you see before you today. And lastly, ad hoc requests. Our budget includes room for ad hoc requests. You'll see there's relatively limited budget for ad hoc requests. So depending on the nature of those requests, we may have to adjust the nature scope of other audit work. But of course, we do want to be adaptable and agile to needs of City Council and just risks as they arise over time. So we reserve some of our budget to accommodate those sorts of requests. You will not see the line item on my subsequent slides for ad hoc requests and the sort of dollars we've reserved within the PowerPoint, but you will see that within the actual report itself. Just a quick depiction. I sort of mentioned this verbally on the prior slide, but phase 1 activities this fiscal year, phase 2 activities cut across fiscal years, and phase 3 activities will be conducted entirely in the next fiscal year. Some minor of this, but This is generally what you're seeing. So the next 3 slides, I have called out each project, and this table is taken directly, or at least the columns that you see, directly from the report itself. I'm not going to read each audit objective word for word, but I will cover sort of the project, why it was selected at a high level as we go. The X's in the left-hand column, those are projects for which I have attached a task order to the report itself, and I'm asking for approval today. And you'll see as we get further, audit activities that'll cut across years in phase 2 and audit activities for next fiscal year, phase 3. We're not asking for approval of all of those. So these are all X's here because we want to get started on this work, but that's not the case for all of the projects we're working on. Construction project controls. So this is not the public safety building audit, but rather a review of project-related controls associated with capital projects. So again, the city has a robust capital improvement program. We want to assess the control environment and make sure that processes and controls are operating effectively and that we're spending city dollars wisely and in accordance with policy through this audit activity. Asset capitalization. Mr. Tanaka, I believe actually you asked several questions about this in the financial audit presentation, but there was essentially an accounting error made that resulted in the error was an increase to assets, and that should have been recorded as expenses. The correction then, of course, was to decrease the value of assets and increase expenses. So, essentially an accounting error. The purpose of this audit is to determine whether that's a pervasive issue and make recommendations for improvements in the future to avoid this sort of circumstance. This next one, the third row here, you'll actually see in both years. So I've essentially created 2 discrete audit activities, one this fiscal year and one next fiscal year. But the city is undergoing an upgrade of its ERP system. SAP is the software solution. And phase 1 of that upgrade has been completed. So it's essentially to transition from an old version of SAP to a new version of SAP. Phase 2 of that project is to evaluate additional functionality that can be implemented to streamline processes and be more efficient. The city audit function is proposing that we are sort of an advisor to the project steering committee. And as new functionality is considered for implementation, we act as a sort of an independent and objective party to make recommendations related to internal control and process efficiency. So essentially, as efficiency measures are considered, we're able to chime in and say, hey, have you considered this? Or don't do that because that will be improper system control design. IT risk management. So this is a look at many key risk areas and the associated controls in the IT function. So this is sort of a broad project that we really like to start with governmental organizations. We take a look at a variety of risks, and we look at the associated controls in the IT function. So IT governance and IT security are 2 primary areas we would look at. IT security, of course, being critically important, and looking and evaluating those controls are really important for the audit function, and avoiding malware, hacking, all of those sorts of things we hear in the news are critically important. So we want to make sure those controls are designed effectively. Investment management. I'm going to propose this one, and then in about 3 slides, I'm going to say, let's move this around. But investment management, essentially the city has significant dollars, cash on hand, and there's a policy through which that guides the investments that can be made with those funds. We want to make sure that the city, and there's significant dollars invested within the city, and that's across the entire city. So we want to make sure that we're adhering to the policies, and also do a little bit of best practice research to see if there's any enhancements that can be made to the investment management function. Power purchase agreements. So This relates to the utilities. The city itself doesn't generate power, but rather purchases all of its power through several power purchase agreements, one of which was just renewed. If I recall correctly, it was, I don't recall, but the type of renewable energy that's purchased. But so the city provides electricity to its customers and purchases that from other third parties. This project would be designed to evaluate the process we go through to engage in those purchase power agreements, but then also look at contract compliance with those associated agreements. So we do a little bit of digging into compliance requirements, how we're billed, and make sure we're adhering to, we and those third parties are adhering to the contract. This is a lot of info, so sorry. Phase 2 activities. So again, these cut across 2 fiscal years. Economic recovery advisory. The majority of the tasks associated with this project we envision actually will be conducted next fiscal year. And those activities really are to take a look at the city's long-term financial projection model and offer an independent, objective look and make recommendations for enhancement. So the reason we want to do that next year is actually the long-term financial planning exercise is something that takes place in the early part of the fiscal year to inform then the budgeting process that takes place in the second half of the year. So, running concurrently to that process in the early part of next fiscal year to ensure that those independent objective observations can be made for subsequent planning. Now, why is this act here, and why am I suggesting that we sign this task order? Essentially, what we want to have the ability to do is offer independent and objective advice, potentially research, as the city goes through the current budgeting process. So if there's questions that arise, city council potentially wants to gain a little bit of comfort around things that are associated with the financial projection model or the budgeting process, and it makes sense for audit to take a look. We want to be able to essentially offer ad hoc assistance and ad hoc advisory during the budget process that's going to take place over the next several months. So we haven't definitively determined what those activities might be, but essentially want to be on the ready should any questions arise that we can help with. And then the remaining activities, I'll go through a little bit more quickly just because I'm not asking for approval of the task orders, but building permit and inspection process. This is a big category, but essentially what we want to do is dive in, identify areas of pain point and potential areas of customer dissatisfaction, and identify and pinpoint specifically why those pain points exist, and offer recommendations for efficiency or effectiveness enhancements that could be made to processes. And that would likely involve benchmarking against industry practices and other comparable organizations. Nonprofit agreement and risk management. So, of course, this topic has come up associated with some specific agreements. We don't intend on focusing in on those specific agreements, but rather to take a look holistically at our process for engaging with third parties and make sure that we have the appropriate controls and practices in place to potentially manage selection, but also for ongoing monitoring of performance. There was also an audit activity that was conducted several years ago, and we want to follow up on some of the recommendations that were made just to validate that they were indeed implemented. And phase 3, so we have that SAP project. That is exactly the same as I described before, but just the FY22 portion of that exercise. Application lifecycle management. So this is an audit activity that's associated with the IT department. I would say, in many organizations, managing applications can be extremely painful. Certain department, I'm generalizing here, but certain departments can, in other organizations, can purchase technology, develop tools internally, and then it becomes a very painful process for the IT department to govern the IT function. and ensure that proper application lifecycle management is taking place. So essentially, we want to look at the controls and processes the City of Palo Alto deploys to ensure that the application lifecycle process is efficient and effective. Wastewater treatment plant, couple of things I would say here. So there is a financial audit that's conducted annually, and that is an opinion as to how the costs, the accumulated costs to run the facility are allocated to the various other organizations with which the City of Palo Alto has agreements. Our activity would be a level deeper. So we want to take a look at how costs are, those accumulated costs are derived, whether we're attributing direct and indirect costs appropriately to the overall cost to run the wastewater treatment plant, which again are then allocated to the partners. And we also want to consider upcoming capital costs and what the implications of that are on costs to run the treatment plant and how those are allocated to the partners. Work order process and accounting. So this is actually a utility project. So in the utility space, costs are accumulated and attributed to the various utilities and assets through work order processes. So, you know, the majority of the work that is done, costs that are spent, dollars that are spent, go through the work order process. So I go out to repair a sewer line, I go out to repair an electric line. All of the costs of my labor, the materials that we put in are attributable to those work orders. Those work orders then down the line are how we derive rates or how we plan for capital costs, how we identify where we need to invest in capital costs. So that work order process and the accounting is critically important to how we run the utility operation. So this would be an audit activity to identify key risk areas. So we're not going to audit every single work order process, at least not yet, but identify the most critical areas, document and evaluate those processes and controls in place, and perform tests of those costs that are accumulated to ensure that they're appropriately attributed to those assets, which again then have further down the road implications to your customers. And the last item here relates to the public safety building. So in the report itself, you will see a whole bunch of TBDs. Well, of course, our report was written before that project was approved, and we weren't entirely certain whether or not it was going to be approved. So I'm suggesting, again, a subsequent slide here, that we reprioritize this project to a phase 1 activity and deprioritize the investment management activity. Again, I'll get to that here in a moment. But this project would be to look at the controls in place related to processing of vendor invoices. And because this is a fixed fee type of project, we want to make sure, as an independent objective party, that change orders are properly justified and mathematically accurate. Now, how this project would run, the construction will take up a specific duration, and at essentially each month, we will have a chunk of time devoted to helping review invoices and making sure controls are operating effectively. And then also, over that duration of the entire project, help review change orders and make sure they're properly justified. So it's not this will actually probably be considered a phase 2 activity in that it'll split across multiple fiscal years once we've reprioritized. It's a lot of information. I think I'm covering, yes, one more slide, and then I'm sure you all have a number of questions. But so the recommendation is, ultimately for this to go to City Council for acceptance. And if necessary, that would be contingent upon any updates we discuss here. And I believe that that's a possible way we can craft the action item for this evening for approval. So obviously that discussion is pending. Potential updates to consider or discuss. So really, I've mentioned this, but it's reprioritizing that public safety building project. So because we know we're going to conduct it, and we know construction is going to kick off in the next couple months, we want to move that up the list. So we likely want to move that from priority 3 to priority 2 that'll cut across multiple fiscal years. And what we would do between now and when this goes to the board, or excuse me, the council agenda item, we would craft the task order that would achieve the objectives we've outlined in the PowerPoint tonight. So subsequent approval would include that task order. Because we're doing that, and that means that we're spending or incurring additional costs this year, that means that we would need to deprioritize something on the phase 1 or phase 2 list. And in this case, I'm suggesting that we deprioritize the investment management audit. That is a very logical one to deprioritize for one significant reason. The individual or the function responsible for investment management within the city actually also is responsible for debt issuance. So they are going to be extremely busy over the next several months, and it would likely not be fair for us to ask for them to undergo an audit while they're issuing some of the largest debt the city has ever issued. So deprioritizing that while reprioritizing the public safety building is a likely recommendation that I'm making to you to consider and discuss this evening. Lastly, and I mentioned this way back when in our update earlier, our quarterly update, we are in the midst of preliminarily pursuing a 1-year contract extension with the financial auditors. If indeed we go down that path, which is looking more likely that we will, and there will be council action associated with that. But if we do indeed do that, what that means for Baker Tilly is that some of the activities that we budgeted for this fiscal year will actually occur next fiscal year. And we can potentially kick off audits this year earlier than anticipated. So if indeed we go down that path, there will be budget impact to Baker Tilly and our work for the city. And we will consider those budget impacts and make recommendations for further changes to the audit plan at subsequent policy and service committee meetings. So just want to point out that that's a likely future change that's already on our radar, and we will update you as we go on that item specifically. All right, I just said quite a lot. So Ms. Koo, I'll turn it over to you, and happy to answer any questions and go back up and down through slides as necessary.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of work that you've conducted, and I know that you had called most of us to chat with us also to get our opinions and our thoughts. But if it's okay with my colleagues, I think I owe the general public their public comments before, since we have been going through the presentation. So if there is any members of the public who would like to speak before I come to council colleagues, let's see if anybody has any comments. Does anybody have any public comments?
If any members of the public wish to comment on agenda item number 1, please raise your hand in the Zoom app. Chair Koo, this time it looks like we have no public comment.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll come back to my council colleagues. Anybody have questions? Don't be shy. If not, I
just have one question, Chair Koo.
Go ahead.
So Mr. O'Rourke, I assume you and I had the discussion last week during the public safety building item, where you described the auditing plan kind of taking the place of the oversight committee that I was proposing. That's what you're suggesting gets moved to up to phase 1, correct?
That's exactly correct.
Perfect. Yeah, and thanks for going through that. Now, especially, and I understood it when you talked about it during that item, but now having the full context makes much more sense to me now as well, and I feel much more confident in the oversight of this project. So thanks, and I'll definitely support moving that up as you're suggesting.
Thank you. Councilmember Tanaka?
So thank you for putting this together. I also think moving that up makes sense given given the decision. I really like how you're looking at trying to improve the customer service, because I've heard through my office hours, I hear a lot about that, right? Just people aren't happy with some of the customer service for the development center. Is that also going to include like trying to get some surveys? So when the services are delivered, to try to see how people rate their experience?
It potentially could. So I left, this is the one slide of my presentation that I left out, but I guess I'll explain this now. So at the onset of each of these projects, we will go through what I would call a project level risk assessment. And that's the point at which we reach out to members of council, we reach out to the process owners and functional area experts, and really hone in on specific risks and areas of interest within each within each identified audit activity, and from there develop an audit plan. So step by step, here's everything we're going to do. So right now you're seeing audit objectives. That at the end of phase one, you'll see specific step by step everything that we're going to conduct as part of the audit. So I would say at this point, potentially it could. My one hesitation to saying yes is that effort can be a little bit costly. And I think if we were to scope that out, it would eat up, I wouldn't say a good chunk, but maybe a little bit more than I'd like to of that project budget. So yes, we can absolutely consider it. And if indeed we're hearing that as sort of a common theme, we would incorporate that into our audit work.
I think the city manager might be actually trying to get some sort of system in place to kind of automatically survey people when services are rendered. So you may want to check in on that. And if they do, then perhaps you could leverage the data that you guys get from that as part of a feedback loop for you guys to do the audit.
That's a great suggestion. And I would say, there's obviously the citizen survey. So there's potential data, whether it be, qualitative or quantitative, that we could leverage. So I guess point being, existing data sources that we might already have. And in addition, what we can do, and again, I'm somewhat hesitant to be committal, but Baker Tilly has Qualtrics licenses. So I have developed surveys pretty quick in the past. Obviously, we want to go through a QA process to make sure we're asking the right questions. But we absolutely can reach out to customers that have gone through the process and do that in a statistically relevant way. So we do have the ability to do that. We have in the past with other organizations done focus groups. So essentially invite members of the public or folks that have gone through specific processes to come to a hour-long, whatever it ends up being, session to offer their opinions. And we get from that, of course, qualitative information related to the processes. And in the past, we've also sub-selected or sample selected individuals that have gone through processes like the building permit process and conducted interviews with them. So we have many mechanisms to solicit input from our customers. Obviously, if we have data already readily available, that's the easiest and most cost-effective way to do it. But if we do not, in all likelihood, we'll design procedures to gather data in some other fashion.
Okay, great. I'd like to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to review the budget overview that's in the staff report. With the change, the deprioritization of the investment management and then prioritizing the public safety building, is the FY21 cost and FY22 cost going to remain the same?
Yes, it will. So what will happen, and this is, I'm going to give you a short answer is yes. What will happen in a more complex sense is the public safety building will span across 2 years here. So in addition to that change to the audit plan, we will in all likelihood move the timetable up for an additional audit so that we are incurring this exact cost in FY21 and the exact cost mentioned here in FY22. So my goal as a sort of overarching manager of our work with the city and of course the budget as a result is to stick to these budgets. So I'm going to very actively manage our budget and move projects around such that we adhere to this. I would say, and I don't know if you're going to go down the path of asking this question, but I've already been informed of the potential impact of scenarios that are selected by council and the ask that the city might have of Baker Tilly as it pertains to budget reduction. And if indeed we are asked to reduce our budget, I have in the back of my mind a couple things that we could do, for budget reduction measures. So short answer, yes, we will adhere to these budgets with those shuffling of audits. And if indeed the city comes to Baker Tilly and asks us to contribute, that's probably not the right word, but to the budget reduction efforts, we will make our best effort to do so and come up with a plan to achieve the objectives outlined for our function.
I appreciate you thinking ahead. Thank you. So is there any other questions? Monique, Chantel, Molly? If none, then any? I see you unmuted.
No, I was just going to say that we're very happy to be working with Baker Tilly. This has been a great relationship so far, so we look forward to our work coming up in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Assistant Manager. And with that, we're open to motions. Yes. Okay.
I'll make a motion to move the staff report.
And is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, thank you.
Is it appropriate for me to ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess I'm proposing sort of in my PowerPoint changes to the staff report. Does the motion need to be contingent upon me making updates, the suggested updates, so that what goes to council includes those two changes, deprioritization and reprioritization of the other audit? I guess I'm not certain of process, but want to be sure what we approve here is, what we want to get started on in March.
So I would highly suggest that you do that that you do that, so that you give them a complete overview of what you've discussed over here tonight, and that it already be incorporated into your presentation. So perhaps maybe even change the motion, include, yeah, okay, it's included already.
I think that's what Councilmember Stone intended, was to move the staff recommendation. He said staff report, but I think he means as amended this evening.
Yes, correct. Thank you.
Okay, does that look all right to the maker and the seconder?
So I'm just reading it to make sure.
Maybe as a reader, I do have a question. So I'm going to ask this, but I assume it's probably true. But is the budget that's being asked for, is that actually allocated? I mean, like we're within the budget that we have allocated, or is this more, or is this less? I don't know if Kyle, you could speak to that.
So the budget that I'm recommending is exactly the budget in our contract. So that reconciliation Ms. Koo referred to is directly reconciled to our contract, and actually is why I included it in the report, despite it being slightly confusing.
No, I saw that. No, but I guess my question though is, because we also have a budget, right? And I don't know if Monique or Chantel, either of you guys know, like, is that the amount? We're not going to have to do some sort of like budget adjustment for this, do we?
So I just got an offline text from Kylie that what's proposed is within what it was contained in the FY21
Okay,
budget.
great. Okay.
Correct.
I didn't want to have to look it up myself, so thank you.
Okay. Can I just get confirmation that,
Yeah,
You-
the motion looks good to me.
okay, Councilmember Tanaka?
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, then let's go for a vote. Can we do I just call? Yes, I do call. Councilmember Stone?
Yes.
You have a, Councilmember Tanaka?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Okay. So we're all set. And now, thank you very much, Mr. O'Rourke, for your presentation and for staying up late tonight.
Chair Ku, just one question. I think, but I just want to confirm, usually when something comes unanimous out of committee, it goes on consent, but I think the intention here was that this would be an action item because it's the new auditor's first opportunity to present an audit plan to the council.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, this is the intention that that this is a big audit plan, and it's also the first one that Mr. O'Rourke has done. So it's a great opportunity for him to introduce it as an action item.
Great.
So we look forward to that. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
And I would say, I don't know if this is appropriate to say at this time, but Monique, or if anybody has any candid feedback for what they'd like to see differently in the full council presentation, I would more than look to hear that. And I know we budgeted a certain amount of time for that. I don't recall if it's 2 hours, but if it is, then what happened tonight would flawlessly work. But I'll make sure to seek to adhere to the time we've reserved for that, given all that's going on with the city.
Okay, so you guys will coordinate. Thank you. So we'll just move into our next item, which is future meetings and agendas. So this colleagues or Monique, Chantel, do you have any suggestions, any placements of some of the agenda items that council had referred?
I see Councilmember Tanaka with his hand still raised.
Oh,
so I don't know.
okay, sorry. I didn't see that. Thank you. Go ahead,
Okay.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Okay, thank you. One question I just have, and I'm sure there's a really good reason for it, but can we, like, maybe this is policy services, something we could talk about for policy services, but you know, we have this kind of like oral vote, right? And like roll call vote. And I'm just wondering, can we not just use Zoom to vote instead of orally? Because I've been on other calls where they've actually done it. So, and I don't know whether it's something in our procedure or something, but I'm just wondering, you know, it might maybe not just for us here on policy and services, but maybe for on council as well, it could save some time where we don't have to do roll call every single time. I don't know. I mean, it just struck me as kind of a because I was actually on a call with the first time on the Senate, was it the Valley Water, and there's like 20 people on there, and it's like roll call, and like, I mean, if you imagine really calling off 20 names, it's like, wow. So it's not so bad in our case here, but you know, it could save some time. So I'm just wondering, but I've been on other calls where we all did vote electronically. Like the last time we did the selection of the mayor by texting, right? So, you know, maybe we could look at that or something, right? Just where it could speed it up. Maybe there's something. I'm just wondering in terms of efficiency of our meetings, can we look at something like that?
So just a comment, Chair Ku, I believe that the governor's order that allows this type of meeting by suspending certain parts of the Brown Act for because of the COVID does require a roll call vote, but I will confirm that and I'll let the committee know if there's any flexibility there. I can't speak to what other organizations are doing to comply.
Well, I'm just speaking
but
about,
of course we want to comply.
I was just speaking about our own organization, because I remember like selection of the mayor and vice mayor. I think we were all here,
No.
maybe not Kyle, but I mean, we all voted by texting. So
No, council member, that was a roll call vote as well. It was handled with 2 steps so that all council members cast their vote simultaneously. And then the roll call part was done by the clerk after that. And so that was a special procedure, but it still complied with the requirement for a
okay.
verbal statement of the vote.
Okay, well, anyways, if you could look into it, that'd be great, because I think all the council members would rejoice in terms of being able to vote a lot, just a tad bit faster, just get a few more minutes extra in the day.
I think also there's if it's not called out, then the general public might not know how each person voted.
Oh, no, I think
And
we could still do that. It could be displayed by the, or maybe we all text the clerk and she puts it up on the slide, like, here's what the vote was.
I
But I'm
see.
just trying to think, so it's not like, anyways, it's not a big deal,
sure,
but it's just something that would speed it up a little bit.
I'm sure Ms. Stump will let us know, but thank you. So if we go, we're almost at 9, 5 more minutes. I was trying to get you guys to finish by 9. So future meetings and agendas. Chantal?
Yes,
Ms.
good
Gaines.
evening. Chantel Cotton Gaines, Deputy City Manager. We have a couple of things related to the CDAW work. The summit that was mentioned, we are actively working on planning that. And Minka and our Community Services Department is pulling together a lot of details on it. So we'll have a report out on that soon. And we also have some of the items related to the race and equity work that we'll be bringing to the committee in some upcoming agendas. One of those came up at the council retreat, which is an update on the mental health response, which is CAHOOTS, PERT, whichever acronym you want to refer to the mental health work with. There are about 3 or 4 of them. So we will be bringing that to your March meeting, which was the referral that came up at the retreat as an update. And I believe there was one more. Monique, can you remind me of what the other one was? There was a second one from the retreat.
I'm afraid I don't have it on my screen just now, but I do know that we're meeting with you, Chair Koo, to review all the referrals. So if anyone has a preference or something that they feel has some urgency, feel free to let me know. And
Okay.
we'll be meeting with you later this week, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I will be meeting with you so we can discuss that further, but thank you. And I'm glad, Ms. Gaines, that you brought up the CDAW because one of the members of the public did mention that. So she has some update now. And of course, you know of her offer that they have volunteers in place. So
Yes.
thank you. If
Really
there's,
appreciate it.
I'm sure. And they have the knowledge too, so it's great guidance. So if there's, is there any other questions or comments from my colleagues?
No, for my
No?
first policy and services meeting, this was very nice. I
Congratulations.
can't believe we're out of here in 2 hours.
Okay, so I want to keep my promise, right? With that, if there's nothing more, then I'll, do I need a vote for adjournment? No, so meeting is adjourned and it's 8:58. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you all. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.